Well, we'll get started. Good evening, everybody. Let me pray, and then I'll read some scripture. Father in heaven, we thank you for your church and for the goodness of your Son, who is righteous, who is holy, who is entirely obedient to your will and to your law, fulfilling all righteousness in our place. And we thank you that he has given himself for his bride. We pray that you would preserve his bride pure, that he might be pleased to receive her. We pray that you would preserve particularly the Presbyterian Church in America, that she would hold fast to the faith once for all delivered to the saints with integrity, with joy, and that you would grant peace to your church. For Jesus' sake, amen. Let me read some scripture. This is Paul's letter to Timothy, chapter 4, verse 11. Command and teach these things. Let no one despise you for your youth, but set the believers an example in speech and conduct and love and faith and purity. Until I come, devote yourself to the public reading of Scripture, to exhortation, and to teaching. Do not neglect the gift that you have, which was given you by prophecy when the council of elders, or presbytery in the Greek, laid their hands on you. Practice these things, immerse yourself in them, so that all may see your progress. Keep a close watch on yourself and on the teaching. Persist in this, for by doing so, you will save both yourself and your hearers. So, I want to give a report on the General Assembly. There was a written report distributed on the interwebs. So we'll be interacting with that a little bit, but also going into additional matters. So this year's General Assembly for the Presbyterian Church in America was the most significant in a generation. It was our 50th assembly. We marked a half century of existence. The assembly was punctuated with reflections from people of significance, both those who were there at the first General Assembly as well as more younger voices. The assembly nonetheless moved more decisively in a Westminster Reformed direction as she strengthened her commitment to be a continuing Presbyterian church. And many of you will remember that was the identity of the church back in 1973. They wanted to be the continuing Presbyterian church before they even settled on a name, which they shortly changed. And to help ring in the 50th year, they on Wednesday morning had a seminar with four of the founding fathers, four of the men who have been in the PCA for these 50 years: Wayne Herring, Charles McGowan, Paul Koistra, and O. Palmer Robertson. Most of those men emphasized the hardships they endured in the old denomination. The PCUS, of course, professed the Westminster Standards, professed the biblical faith, but in truth, the PCUS was hostile to the truth and desired to cast off a Reformed heritage. So that is a lesson for us, that we should demand integrity with what we say we profess. If we say we believe these things, if these things are in our standards, we should uphold them. Now, you can go back and watch the seminar if you want, but there was a little bit of tension between what the men recollected. Some of them, well, one of them took a softer view of the old PCUS, that the people in that church weren't all that bad, but the other three seemed to all agree, it was an apostate denomination. Palmer Robertson was undoubtedly the most significant gave the most significant address, and he had urged the assembly to steadfastness. He was the last speaker, and so he had the least amount of time, especially since the penultimate speaker ate into his time a little bit. But the good people at World Magazine and Presbycast interviewed Dr. Robertson and asked him to just give your full address, and so that's available online now. Certainly worth a listen. But from the beginning, there was a tension in the PCA. One of the issues that we've gone back and forth on as a denomination is, will we be a big tent as a denomination, or will we be a denomination that is decidedly, distinctively Reformed? Now, those who argue for that we need to be a big tent, right, not particularly committed to the Westminster Confession of Faith and catechisms, they'll say, well, a few churches in the old PCUS were decidedly reformed. The ministers in the 60s and 70s were educated in seminaries where the Bible was not believed, and the Reformed confessions were not embraced. And so, sure, in the 60s and in 1973, there were very few churches that you could point to in the old PCUS and say, that is a Reformed Presbyterian church. One of the seminar speakers even seemed to lament that men who came in the PCA at her founding, he said, well, some of them couldn't be ordained today. But I think that's a sign of health when ministerial standards are increasing. Right? I think I saw a report from the Department of Defense saying they were going to have to lower their minimum physical fitness proficiency rating standard because they just can't get people. That's not a good thing when you have to lower the standard. And so when the standards for ordained ministry are increasing, that's a sign of health. But yes, in the beginning, you had men who came, who left the PCUS who were not decidedly reformed. They may have had a general belief in the sovereignty of God. They may have been somewhat Calvinistic, but did they understand the deep things of the Westminster Standards? Maybe not. But was the PCA intended to be a big tent or a decidedly Reformed and Presbyterian church? Now, both sides can appeal to the founding fathers in support. But consider what the PCA did when she was founded. She did not adopt the broad, diluted standards of the PCUS. She went back and adopted the Westminster Standards as they were amended by the Americans in 1788. So she returned to her roots. The PCA, or the Continuing Presbyterian Church, and then the National Presbyterian Church, and then eventually the PCA, was founded with the intent that she would be a Reformed and Presbyterian church. That she would return to the theological roots and moorings that had been lost in the previous 75 years in the PCUS. And so there is this tension within the PCA of, will we be a big tent, or will we be a well-defined spiritual house? And that tension may have reached a decisive turning point at the 50th General Assembly, after a half century of robust theological education having borne abundant fruit. Before the PCA was founded in the late 60s, the presidents of the seminaries that served the PCUS, the four of them, each contributed to literature and to answer the question, do we have an infallible Bible? Is the Bible inerrant and infallible? And you know what the four presidents of the four denominational seminaries said? No. They said no, and we don't need one. So that is the context in which the PCA was founded, where men were being trained at seminaries where the belief in the Bible wasn't essential, wasn't a non-negotiable. And so 50 years later, yes, we are more reformed. Yes, we are more committed to the Scripture. We are more committed to the Reformed faith and the Great Commission. Why? Because we've had better education. In 50 years, we've had a generation and a half to benefit. So I think this was a turning point assembly. So let's look at some of the assembly. I want to talk about the structure of the assembly and compare the committees of commissioners man, that's a long word. I should have made a PowerPoint. It would have been quicker. Versus the perma committees. Look at that. We can abbreviate. So one of the ways that the old PCUS, the old denomination, liberalized was through her institutions, her agencies, her committees, which were dominated by presbycrats who wanted to be big and broad. Because if you're big and broad, that means more power for the central people. And so the founding fathers of the Presbyterian Church in America, the Continuing Presbyterian Church, and then the National Presbyterian Church, and then eventually changing its name to PCA, the founding fathers believed that centralization was the stronghold of theological drift. And so what they wanted to do was prevent any centralized authority within the denomination, just spread it out. In fact, it was only after the PCA merged with the RPCES in 1982 that the PCA granted permission for its agencies to be located in the same cities. Right now, if you call PCA headquarters, and I don't like to be called headquarters, but you call Atlanta. But it used to be these were spread across 4 cities. So MCW would be in one city, M&A would be, Mission of North America would be in another city, Christian Education and Publications would be in another city. So they were spread out because the founding fathers believed that centralization is the stronghold of liberalization. The founding generation was very wary of these presbycrats colluding and cooperating. But nonetheless, you still need permanent committees. You still need a committee to oversee the work of your agencies, right? If you have Mission to North America, you've got to have somebody, some group of people that oversees that. And so they understood we need permanent committees. But in the old PCUS, in the old denomination, it was the permanent committees that trended liberal. And so they said, we need something to stop the tendency of liberalism. Now, the permanent committees are elected, a portion of them each year. Each year, the presbyteries nominate men to fill those positions, and then you can also nominate elders from the floor of the General Assembly and a few deacons for 1 or 2 of the committees. And so these men are elected to 3 or 4 year terms. And so you have a group that are elected every year. And the permanent committees oversee the staff. They recommend policies for these agencies to the General Assembly. And these permanent committees oversee the staff to make sure that the policies of the General Assembly are implemented. And so because you have a permanent committee where it's not changing in its makeup every year, you can do some long-term planning. And you can re-elect people to those committees. But remember, the permanent committees is where liberalism hides and spreads like cancer, at least under the view of our founding fathers. And so what they came up with was this genius dual system of committees of commissioners. Now, if you go to the General Assembly, you are a commissioner. You are either commissioned by a session to represent that session, or if you're a teaching elder, you represent yourself. But you are a commissioner. So these committees of commissioners are elected, or actually they're appointed. They're elected by their presbyteries, but then appointed by their presbyteries to review the work of the permanent committee. So these committees of commissioners, they change every year. And in fact, different presbyteries are eligible to send men to different permanent committees because each presbytery can only can appoint members to half of the permanent committees. So there again, you have these fresh eyes, this tendency, this stopgap against centralization and liberalization. And so these permanent committees are reviewed by the committees of commissioners every year. They review the minutes. They ask questions of the staff and maybe even the chairman of the permanent committee. And these committees of commissioners bring recommendations to the assembly based on the work of the permanent committee. So you have the committee of commissioners bringing recommendations and the permanent committees bringing recommendations during the same report. Now, that sounds arcane and really intricate, but there's genius there. Because there's this extra level of oversight, there's this added fresh eyes. And so sometimes, though, those recommendations are the same. In fact, most of the time, those recommendations are the same. But not always. A notable example would be last year when the Permanent Special Committee on Interchurch Relations recommended recommended remaining in the National Association of Evangelicals. But the Committee of Commissioners said, no, we want to, we should leave the National Association of Evangelicals because they're becoming too political, they're too friendly with the sodomites, we need to get out. And so what happens when you have these competing recommendations? The Assembly decides. And of course, the Assembly always decides because these are committees, right? These are committees. They're not commissions. It's a committee of commissioners, but it's a committee. So it has no power to decide anything. This year, there was a difference between the Permanent Committee for Reformed University Fellowship and the Committee of Commissioners for Reformed University Fellowship. The Reformed University Fellowship Atlanta staff has been working to develop for years now a new affiliation agreement between itself and the local campus ministries and the presbytery. So in Tennessee Valley Presbytery, we have a number of Reformed University Fellowship campus ministries at UTC. I think there's 2 of them. There might be 2 at Knoxville as well, one for English speakers and an international. And then there's a number of others for some of the smaller schools. But this affiliation agreement sets out, it's a contract deciding what will be the relationship between the campus minister and the presbytery, as well as Atlanta, the permanent committee. Because remember, if you go to McDonald's, you expect it to be like every other McDonald's, right? Greasy, smelly, dirty, uncomfortable chairs. You just expect that at McDonald's, right? Now, if you go to Freddy's, we have Freddy's in Fort Ogle Fort now. We have hit the big leagues, right? You expect it to be delicious, custardy, kind of slow in getting it out there, but oh man, worth the wait. But you expect the same experience. Well, with RUF, you have the right to expect a similar experience, whether you are at RUF at UTK or UTC or out in Utah. Right? So Atlanta, rightly so, wants to make sure that RUF, whether you're at Alabama or UTC or somewhere else, is operating in a very similar way. Not necessarily like a franchise where one McDonald's is exactly like the others, but that they are all operating in the same way. And so that's fine. That's good. We want that consistency. But this year, the permanent committee decided that it would have the authority to hire and fire the campus ministers. Now, who has the authority to hire and fire a minister in the Presbyterian Church in America? The presbytery. Only the presbytery has that authority. If a congregation wants to get rid of its minister, if a session wants to get rid of an assistant pastor, it has to go to presbytery and say, this is why we want to be rid of this man. And they say, well, do you agree? And he'd say, well, yeah, they gave me 6 months severance, so I agree. Usually there's an agreement. But this year, Atlanta decided we want that authority for all of our campus ministers. So that's a substantive change. Whereas previously it would be the presbytery has the authority. Now some presbycrat in Atlanta or some committee member, permanent committee majority can say, well, he's done. Now, would they do this with the best interests of the church in mind? Almost certainly. But the principle is we are Presbyterians. And so that has 2 implications. Number one, the permanent committee cannot make that change. Right? A committee cannot tell a presbytery, either you sign this agreement or you lose your RUF campus ministry, which is what we were told on the floor. Well, if a presbytery won't sign it, you can continue to have a campus ministry, but you cannot call it RUF. All right, you have to be, so it'd be like if McDonald's had to start calling itself what is it? McDowell's from you have to call it something different. Well, the General Assembly said, no, you work for us. Tell you what you're going to do. Next year, you're going to bring your affiliation agreement to the General Assembly, and we will vote it up or down. But until that time, you cannot terminate any affiliation agreement with the presbytery that's already in play. So again, a very intricate debate. It was probably a 45-minute debate, but a very important one and a triumph for PCA. Right? We need to see this not as RUF Atlanta versus RUF presbyteries or the permanent committee versus the committee of commissioners, but this is a triumph for Presbyterians. As these 2 groups of elders work together to come to something better and to promote the unity of the wider church. And so these committees of commissioners are a unique feature of PCA polity. At least they were in 1973. I don't know if other denominations since then have adopted a similar polity. But the committees of commissioners offer fresh eyes and perspective, as well as that accountability. And so this dual structure spurs on and fosters greater efficacy for the Great Commission, and even if it imposes this holy slowness, right? RUF, to go back to that example, has been working on this new affiliation agreement for 4 years. It's probably pretty good. But the assembly, standing on principle, says, well, we don't care how good it is. It may be the best contract ever made since Mount Sinai. But we're Presbyterians. So you're going to bring your contract to us through our committee of commissioners next year, and we're going to make a decision based on the recommendations that we receive. So that was one example of what happens when these committees of commissioners disagree with the permanent committee. One other thing the Assembly did this year was approve something called Overture 7, which gives you a whole lot of information. Overture 7 deals with, sets forth actually precisely that the permanent committees do report to the General Assembly through the committees of commissioners, and they must every year highlight how they are fulfilling the Assembly's mandates and provide a précis, a summary of any policy change that they have adopted, so that the Assembly can vote it up or down. So this is a good change. It's a good requirement. It strengthens our existence as Presbyterians and our commitment to our polity, because principles are important. All right, Mel Gibson, I'm a father, I don't have the luxury of principles. Principles are a luxury, and we should appreciate that we have them, and we should uphold them. All right, well, let's move on to the election of a moderator. We've kind of gone into some of the nitty-gritty of how the Assembly functions. The first thing we have to do as an Assembly is elect a moderator, and the moderator is the guy who runs the meeting. And in the election of the moderator, the PCA was showing her age. Randy Pope was nominated by one of our founding fathers, Charles McGowan, one of the younger founding fathers. Many of you may have heard of him. He was the one-time pastor of the largest church in the PCA, a founding pastor of Perimeter Church in Atlanta. Charles McGowan, in his nominating speech of Randy Pope, tried to emphasize the connection between teaching elder Pope as well as two of our older, more senior founding fathers who have since been promoted to glory, Jim Baird and Frank Barker. He even went so far in the end of his nominating speech to say, if these guys were alive today and if they could vote, they would vote for Randy Pope. So in his nominating speech, he tried to portray Randy Pope as the second generation, right? As the heir of that founding generation. On the other hand was Fred Greco, who was nominated by David Strain, David Strain is the pastor of one of our historic flagship churches. He is, in fact, one of the successors to Jim Baird. Fred is the pastor of a medium-sized, ordinary, means of grace, old school Presbyterian church outside Houston. But many people know Fred Greco because he's an expert on church polity. Right? When people get in, mixed up and tied up and can't figure out how to do this, who do they call? They call Fred, and he will walk them through. He will, and so Fred Greco was elected. It was an historic moment because this was an instance in which the denomination was really passed on to that third generation of elders, which is a good thing, right? You don't want any institution in which people are just hanging on, right? Isn't that something that we're concerned about in this country? When you have these leaders who are getting to be very old and not passing on, not training up the next generation. And so the PCA is in a very healthy spot. We have a new third generation rising up to take over from the second generation of leaders. This is a sign of health. All right, well, moving into some of the actions of the Assembly. One of the first things that we did was hear the report of the Review of Presbytery Records Committee. Just as session minutes are reviewed by the Presbytery, and the minutes of these permanent committees are reviewed by the committees of commissioners for the General Assembly, so too Presbytery minutes are reviewed by a committee of the General Assembly each year to ensure that the presbyteries are in conformity to the Constitution. And this year's Review of Presbytery Records report was, I think, 180 something pages long. It's the longest report in the history of the PCA for RPR. Last year's was the longest report in the history of RPR at 160 something pages. And so what we're seeing is another sign of health, that our General Assembly's committee is taking a very close look at what is going on in the presbyteries. And they're bringing thorough, extensive recommendations to the General Assembly. Now, I think all of the recommendations were approved. And it may be the presbytery approved someone's difference with the standards, and the committee says, well, you need to clarify how that does not strike at the vitals of religion. How is that difference acceptable? And so the presbytery then, or the committee will then recommend the assembly cite them with an exception of substance and say, you need to come back next year and tell our committee why you think that action is okay. But in two instances, actually, one, I don't think it's going to be a big deal at all, but one will be, and was quite a debate on the floor. It involved New York, Metro New York. And those of you who know your Presbyterian history know that New York is a very significant place for Presbyterianism. It was there that Francis Mackamee was arrested. He's the founder of Presbyterianism in America. He was arrested by the governor for preaching without a license. And one of the things he did was argue, according to the English Bill of Rights, 1689, that you have the freedom to preach, you have the freedom to believe whatever sect of the Protestant religion you want. And so he was acquitted. So we have that precedent. But also in the 19th century and into the 20th century, you know that a lot of bad things came out of New York City. So New York needs to be watched very closely by the General Assembly. And our Review of Presbyterian Records Committee watched them quite closely. The issue here in particular was a session who had invited Fleming Rutledge, a priestess in the Episcopal Church, to lead a Bible study on the Lord's Day during an event that featured the Lord's Supper. Now, in the Presbyterian Church in America, in the Reformed Church, what is the only event that can feature the Lord's Supper? What is the only event that can feature the sacraments? A called public worship service. Whether that worship service is in a church building or that worship service is in a nursing home with just a few people there, a worship service. Well, this session decided, as they invited this priestess to come lead a Bible study, that they would say what she is doing is not preaching, but leading a Bible study. So it was a unique use of language, to be sure. Numerous elders from across the denomination sent letters to Metro New York asking them to investigate this event that took place in 2021. And the presbytery did. And you know what they said? I don't think those were their literal words, but they kind of just, Review of Presbyterian Records strongly disagreed with the presbytery's, and now they did insist on a few changes. But the Review of Presbyterian Records says, no, this is a problem. And it is problematic for a number of reasons. One is that we are a denomination that believe that the office of preaching is for men only, number one. Number two, another problem is the use of language. Right? If you're going to say, well, it's okay because we're just going to call it something different, that's representing a different sort of hermeneutic, a different sort of epistemology than what we have embraced classically as the Reformed faith. So even those, I think, who would be more friendly to the idea that women are permitted to do a wider variety of things in the worship service, I think many of them were still concerned by this use of language, that we're going to change it to Bible study rather than preaching. And so what Review of Presbyterian Records said is, yes, this is an exception of substance in the way you handle that investigation. But also, you don't just need to respond to the General Assembly. You need to go straight to the Standing Judicial Commission, to the Assembly's court to explain this and for possible censure. So that was the recommendation of the Review of Presbyterian Records Committee. Now, the members of the presbytery and their allies strongly opposed this. They said, look, just cite us. Yes, please cite us with an exception of substance. But we don't need to go to the Standing Judicial Commission. Give us some more time to sort this out and to handle it properly. Well, the Review of Presbyterian Records Committee members and their allies said, no, this happened in 2021. This is now 2023, in case you were, missed that. You've had enough time to fix this, and you haven't. So it's kind of a do not pass go, do not collect $200. You need to explain this to our, which some people have described as the Supreme Court of the denominations. It's not quite that, but that might be an analogy that would be helpful. And so the assembly voted overwhelmingly. I was shocked by the numbers to require Metro New York Presbytery to appear before the Standing Judicial Commission and possibly be censured for this behavior. And so what this does is it reflects an assembly that has shifted in a more confessional direction, one that is willing to enforce her constitution, and also an assembly that is not going to be tolerant of a tricky use of language. She's not preaching; she's just leading a Bible study. So this was again another sign of health. So we've seen multiple signs of health already. Our rising standards for ordination, the picking up of the mantle of the third generation of leaders in the PCA, and now here the assembly upholding our constitutional standards. Another significant vote was for the nominating committee. Remember, the nominating committee, they're the ones who receive the nominations from the presbyteries for men to serve on the permanent committees. And so the nominating committee will take all those nominations, and your presbytery can nominate. We have 88 presbyteries, and I should have looked this up. I don't know how many permanent committee slots we have, but we don't have 88 slots for every committee. So it might be 3 or 4, usually an even number, available each year. And so they will go through all the nominations, and they will pick the one guy for that one slot whom they believe is most qualified and well suited for that position. And this year we had close to, if not record, turnout for the nominating committee. So many presbyteries were represented, and they selected a very strong slate of men who are committed to an old school Presbyterian vision, robust, distinctively reformed vision for the denomination. And so those were the men whom the men who shared that vision are the ones whom they selected as the nominating committee candidates. Now, you can nominate men from the floor, and the only thing that would stop a man from getting on the ballot would be if he's not qualified. If in the case of the Standing Judicial Commission, for example, somebody else from his presbytery is already been elected that year, he couldn't stand. Or other things like that, very factual. And so anybody can get on the ballot for the most part. What the assembly did this year, the assembly did everything its nominating committee asked it to do. And so, again, we had a decided turn toward a more confessional, more robustly reformed denomination. And in fact, there were a couple of turnovers, especially on the Standing Judicial Commission. One historic election was where Rhett Dodson, who's a pastor in Ohio, was elected to the Standing Judicial Commission, Ohio is one of our newer presbyteries, and he's the first member of that presbytery to serve on the Standing Judicial Commission, and he actually is replacing Charles McGowan, who is one of that first generation of leaders. So there's a real passing of the baton, and Charles McGowan from Nashville, the heart of the PCA, whereas Rhett Dodson from Ohio, one of the areas where the PCA isn't as strong. And so we see more signs of health where the denomination is becoming broader geographically. The denomination is having a new generation step up to take the mantle of leadership. So nominating committee went very well. There were a couple of instances where the floor nominee was actually more conservative than the nominating committee nominee, which the nominating committee they were pretty conservative anyway. But I in those instances, I would have were a few of the votes that didn't quite go my way, but I'm still very happy and encouraged. All right, well, let's look at some of the overtures. Any questions so far?
I have one question. This may not be the place to ask it, but which cemeteries does the church sponsor or support?
The PCA owns Covenant Seminary, and so that's the only one that is church PCA owned and operated. But she's served by a number, obviously, of seminaries. Well, let's look at a couple, 3, 4 of the overtures. Overture 12, which I didn't cover in my written report, was a humble petition to the civil magistrates. It was sent up by Evangel Presbytery, which is Birmingham. It was asking the civil magistrates to outlaw and to use the power of the sword, essentially, to stop the mutilation of children. Excuse me. The overture was amended, not to send the letter that Evangel Presbytery had prepared, but to empower the moderator to appoint a commission to draft the letter. And it was to draft a letter, not just the Evangel Presbytery overture asked the civil magistrate to stop the mutilation of children. But the language was amended to ask the moderator to appoint a committee to draft a letter to stop all mutilation, all bodily mutilation, bodily genital mutilation. So it actually became stronger. This was somewhat, there's some back and forth. I think people really liked the Evangel Presbytery, and I think some people forgot who the moderator was, so they were nervous about what committee he would appoint. But Fred Greco is going to appoint a very strong commission if he hasn't already. So that's Overture 12. Overture 13, which was the most controversial of all the matters debated, and the closest vote, was an attempt to amend our Constitution to permit atheists to testify in the church courts. And this was, as I said, hotly debated. Currently, in order to testify in a church trial, you must believe in God, and you must believe that there are rewards and punishments coming in the afterlife. Right? You don't have to be a Christian, but you do have to believe that there is a God and that he rewards and punishes according to some standard. So it's a very low bar, but you are required to be a theist or maybe even a spiritualist. But as part of the last year, we received the Domestic Abuse and Sexual Assault Report. And one of the things they recommended is that we start allowing atheists to testify in church courts, because there could be a situation in which an atheist is the only witness of abuse, or perhaps an atheist is the second witness of abuse. Because remember, you need two witnesses to establish any charge in the court of the Lord Jesus Christ. Well, in my opinion, this is a good concern, but this is really a solution in search of a problem. Because in the 50-year history of the PCA, and this provision in our Constitution goes back to the 19th century at least, not a single person, no one could point to a single instance in which an atheist desired to testify and was denied. And now many of the more progressive brothers in the PCA see this as urgently necessary. We have been told a number of times that there is an abuse crisis within the Presbyterian Church in America. And we've had a number of amendments proposed to our Constitution in light of this. Most of them have been rejected, though. This amendment was our Overtures Committee, which is the committee that makes recommendations on all the proposed changes. They recommended against this. And so there was debate between the chairman of the Overtures Committee and then a person bringing a minority report urging adoption of this. And I think this might have passed if the minority had selected a better representative. The man whom they selected to give their report did a very poor job making his case. His speech was filled with hyperbole, appeals to emotion, hypotheticals. We were urged a number of times, well, what will the world think if we don't do this? What will the news headlines be if we don't do this? So I think that they really handicapped their cause. But also a couple of answers to the concerns that were raised. Number one, there are avenues for, if we need the information that an atheist has, there are avenues by which that could make it into our church courts. Right? A police report is always admissible in a church court. A medical report is always admissible in a church court, not as witness testimony, but as material evidence. If there was a situation in which the atheist was the only witness or the only second witness, the atheist could write up a statement, and it could be notarized, which is then under the penalty of perjury in the civil and criminal courts, and that statement would be admissible in our church courts. Because one of the concerns about admitting atheists to the church courts is that they have no incentive to tell the truth. In the civil courts, if they perjure themselves, they can go to jail. They can be fined. But in the church courts, well, they don't believe that our God avenges. So what incentive do they have to tell the truth? But on the other hand, I think there's another concern that this amendment misunderstood the role of the church courts. This is dealing with abuse. Now, in an abuse situation, who do you call first? Right, you do not call the elders first. You do not call the pastors first. You call the police. Now, if it happens at church, that would be you would talk to the deacons, and the deacons would then immediately contact the civil authorities, because God, in his infinite wisdom, in the governing system that he has established on this earth with various spheres of family, of church, of state, the state is responsible for the protection with the sword of those who are abused. And so it seems as though from the debate and the things that I've read on those advocating for this, for a lot of these amendments, that there's this understanding that the church courts are going to be having this blue ribbon investigation committee. When in reality, what's going to happen is that the civil authorities will, and rightly so, first conduct their investigation. And then the church courts, rightly so, should come behind them with censures, with an investigation, and base their investigation on the material evidence that the civil authorities have already uncovered and investigated. And so this failed. I think it was a 53-47 vote. So a 6-point swing, which is not insignificant, but still the closest of the votes. All right, so that's Overture 13, Overture 23. There was widespread unanimity regarding Overture 23. It passed by 88% of the commissioners. It says it would add this sentence in a number of places in our Constitution regarding ordained officers. He should conform to the biblical requirement of chastity and sexual purity in descriptions of himself, his convictions, character, and conduct. So chastity and convictions, character, and conduct, and that passed by 88%. And so those who voted against it may not have voted against it for the reason you initially think. They may have thought it's not strong enough. But there is the hope that this will forever close the door to what has been called Side B within the PCA, the idea that you can be a gay Christian. If you are a Christian, we don't have alcoholic Christians. We don't have addict Christians. We don't have kleptomaniac Christians. We don't have sodomite Christians. Such were some of you. And so that the hope is that this will close that door completely and permanently. And some of those who are ardent opponents of similar language previously planned to endorse this. And in fact, I've already slated to write articles in favor of it. But there was only one speech in favor of this before the question was called. So great unanimity on this. And then Overture 26 deals with titles. Coming back to something we discussed earlier, there's a creative use of language within the PCA. Currently, our Book of Church Order lists 2 offices. What are the 2 offices in the Presbyterian Church of America? Elder and deacon, right? Now, elders are sometimes called elders, sometimes they're called pastors. But if you ask, who is your pastor? 97% of people would know what you meant by that question. But there are a couple of churches in the PCA who call unordained people pastors. And that's a problem because it's misleading. They're not ordained. Now, ordination is a beautiful thing. In ordination, the session or the presbytery lays hands on a man to recognize the gifts that God has given him, to share in the ministry with them. In fact, that's one of the things we say after we ordain a man. Welcome to share in this ministry with us. But some churches are calling unordained people pastor. That creates confusion. And much more commonly are churches that will call unordained people deacon. Deacons, our Book of Church Orders says all officers are to be inducted to their office by a church court in ordination. But some churches have decided, well, it doesn't say we It says we have to ordain them, but it doesn't say we can't not ordain them. Does that make sense? It doesn't make sense. You know what I mean, but it doesn't make sense. If it says you have to do this, it doesn't say you can't not do this. Yet some churches are doing that. And so we adopted, we passed an amendment that will have to be ratified by the presbyteries that says this: furthermore, unordained people shall not be referred to as or given the titles of the ordained offices of pastor/elder or deacon. And so one sentence that will clarify, if you are calling someone an elder, if you're calling someone a pastor, if you're calling someone a deacon who is not ordained, something's wrong. And if you are not ordaining your deacons, you need to call them something else. You can call them deaconess. You can call them Duchess of Lancaster. You can call them whatever you want, but not pastor, elder, or deacon. And this will help us with unity, with clarity. And really, this again gets to the issue of truth and integrity of our language. And it's a lot of city churches that are doing this, trying to be for the city and less abrasive with. But biblical polity, biblical church government is going to run up against the winds of the culture. And so I think this is another sign of health. I think this was passed by about 74% of the assembly. So hopefully it will have a strong showing in the presbyteries. Well, any questions or comments as we close?
What's happening with national partnership?
That is an interesting question. As far as I know, the national partnership is defunct. There is a new group that has some of the same people, most of whom are alive on their website. Not all of their leaders were alive. That claims to be advancing goals of mission and renewal. Whether they're going to line up one for one, I don't know. I mean, they announced that they existed a week before General Assembly. So there may be, but they're a public organization. And they've got a website, and they're trying to become a 501c3, which is interesting, because if this is a replacement for the national partnership, which I don't know, but some of the characters are the same. So not all of them, though. Not all of them are alive also. But one of the criticisms of the Gospel Reformation Network, which is a network that our church supports and we believe is advancing a faithful vision for the PCA, one of the criticisms of the GRN was that they're a 501c3 and they have a website. They're a political lobbying organization. So this organization may be a counter to that. It may be something different. Time will tell. But yeah, good question. But if the national partnership was there, they certainly weren't making their presence felt.
The overtures that did not pass ratification last year are the presbyteries that failed to vote for them more likely to vote for the ones that are more conformist and more centrist this year?
I think that they are. I was the one who called the question on this Overture 23, which was the replacement for the one that failed last year. And one of a couple actually of the well-known guys who opposed it came up to me very nicely, very politely. It was not adversarial at all. I said, "Hey, I just want to understand, why did you call the question there?" Because I wanted to get up, and my friend wanted to get up, and we wanted to endorse this. We think this is a good way forward for the denomination. So I think that a lot of the big names who had been opposing it will speak out in favor of it. Also, I think, and we saw this especially toward the end of last year, that the situation in St. Louis with one minister in particular, but it was really broader than that. I think became so shocking and so scandalous to even the progressives who had been enabling and supporting him, that they realized we were wrong. In fact, he said this in a blog. David Cassidy said this in a blog. And it was very humble and very gracious of him to say this, that I should, paraphrasing here, but I should have spoken out sooner to voice concerns about Greg. That's public knowledge. So you can go look that up. So I think that they're realizing, we kind of we didn't speak out as quickly and as loudly as we should. So I think there is a desire to fix it. Whether fixing it will be as, to our standards or to good enough standards, we'll see.
Were the presbyteries that typically are more progressive, did the results of these votes and the results of these overtures and things, did that serve to put them on notice that they need to realign their thinking?
It may. And when you have 88%, and especially with what we're seeing with review of presbytery records right now, I think it is putting things on notice. I'm going to end our little broadcast.